Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in just a moment, but in the meantime, we'd love to hear who we've got on the line and what you're looking forward to learning today. So feel free to drop any questions that you want to make sure we cover in that little Q&A box at the bottom. Bienvenue tout le monde, merci pour nous rejoindre. On va commencer en juste un moment, mais en attendant, si vous voulez partager ce que vous voulez apprendre aujourd'hui, n'hésitez pas à écrire des questions pour assurer qu'on va les couvrir dans la séance de questions-réponses plus tard. We're excited to dig into how remote monitoring tools can help support Canadian conservation efforts. And today's webinar is being co-hosted by Upstream Tech, the Ontario Land Trust Alliance, and the Nature Trust of New Brunswick. On est heureux d'avoir l'opportunité d'explorer comment les outils de télédétection peuvent soutenir les efforts de conservation canadiens. Et le webinaire aujourd'hui est organisé en partenariat avec Upstream Tech, Ontario Land Trust Alliance et la Fondation pour la protection des sites naturels du Nouveau-Brunswick. Just as a note for everyone, presentation today is going to be in English, but we'll be taking questions in either English or French at the end, so whatever you're more comfortable with. Pour que tout le monde sache, la présentation aujourd'hui sera en anglais, mais on va répondre aux questions à la fin en anglais ou en français. All right, as we give folks just a moment to get oriented here and get started, just wanted to quickly introduce who is going to be joining us today. My name is Jake Faber. I have been here at Upstream Tech for about the last 4 years or so, working mostly with conservation NGOs and land trusts to help folks get access to remote monitoring tools. We've got Morgan from OLTA as well, who will be joining us in just a moment, and Shraddha and Courtney from Nature Trust of New Brunswick, who are going to be talking a little bit about some of their firsthand experience using remote monitoring for their conservation work. So Morgan, I will hand it over to you to kick us off here with our land acknowledgement.
Okay, thanks, Jake. So we acknowledge and are grateful to the Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of the land. For many thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have inhabited, cared for, and used these lands and waters, applying original instructions, Indigenous knowledge systems, and laws. We also acknowledge those Indigenous peoples who currently live, work, play, and learn on the lands around us. We believe that as a community, we need to learn about, engage, and uphold our role within treaties, settlers' responsibilities, and natural law in order to honor our ongoing commitments to meaningful reconciliation with all Indigenous peoples in whose treaty and ancestral territories we live and work. We are mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile with all of our relations. OLTA has developed a statement on Indigenous conservation and engagement, and we encourage everyone in the land trust community and beyond to learn more about how you can actively take steps towards reconciliation. Next slide. Okay, so while I go over the agenda, we're going to launch a quick poll to get a little bit of a conversation started here. So yeah, welcome and introduction. I'll do a little bit of an intro about OLTA, and then I'll hand it over to Jake, who will go over remote monitoring and different applications. And then our colleagues from Nature Trust of New Brunswick will go over a few case studies and examples of how they apply this technology in their practices every day. And then we'll end off with a couple of more examples of how we can use remote monitoring in our practices for property monitoring and stewardship, and we'll end off with a Q&A. Okay, so yeah, we can close the poll and we can have a look at the results here. So a lot of people interested in conservation easements and preserves, so using remote monitoring for that purpose, and watersheds, restoration projects, less so infrastructure and public lands. But yeah, we will be touching on a lot of that. So that's great. Yeah, hopefully we get to all of that through the presentation. All right, so before we get into the content here, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview about OLTA for those of you that are unfamiliar with us. We are a registered charity with a mission to empower a vibrant and enduring land trust community in Ontario. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with land trusts, they are nonprofit charitable organizations that acquire land or interest in land for the purpose of conservation, access to nature, and community connection. Slide. In Southern Ontario, most of the land is privately owned, And it also holds greater biodiversity than any other part of the province, as well as Canada. So for this reason, supporting land trust is key to the critical protection of biodiversity in Ontario. Currently, over 185,000 acres of significant natural lands and sensitive wildlife habitat are protected through the actions of Ontario's land trusts. OLTA's reach is province-wide through 50 connected conservation groups and thousands of hardworking volunteers, all working towards the same broad goals to protect local natural areas. Next slide. A few of OLTA's key initiatives are listed here. So we host an annual gathering to build a sense of community among land trusts and provide opportunities to gain skills and knowledge. We administer granting programs to support land securement, stewardship, and outreach initiatives, and facilitate collaboration around big issues in conservation science, such as climate change and species at risk. We are working to create welcoming spaces for newcomers and diverse communities to learn more about nature in Ontario and ways to be involved and connect with land trusts and nature. Ultimately, OLTA provides support to land trusts to strengthen organizational capacity to strive for excellence, which includes all facets of their work, from governance and finance to land securement and stewardship. Next slide. Which brings us to the session today. Conservation organizations that hold land or an interest in land are responsible for regular monitoring and stewardship of those properties. For those organizations aiming to meet the Canadian land trust standards and practices, this means monitoring each conservation property at least once per year. As conservation organizations grow and acquire more properties, the time, effort, and resources used on annual on-the-ground monitoring continues to rise. And this could be a limiting factor in an organization's ability to secure new properties and grow their portfolio. So what can we do about this? I'm very excited for today's session. We are going to explore ways that you can incorporate remote monitoring into your annual stewardship and monitoring practices with a few examples how the technology can be applied to conservation in Canada. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Jake, and he's going to talk us through remote monitoring and its various applications. So over to you, Jake.
Excellent. Thanks, Morgan. So I wanted to start out by just talking about how we started thinking about this, working with Lens and some of the land trust partnerships that we have. I think that what we have seen over the last handful of years, especially from land trusts, is that I think it's kind of obvious, right? That understanding how landscapes change depends on the information that we're able to get as we do all of our stewardship and monitoring work each year. Stewardship, we recognize, is a long-term commitment, and so the better information we have to help make management decisions, the further our capacity can go. So remote monitoring has been something that I think has posed a lot of challenges around access, and so that specifically is the challenge that we're most interested in solving. So Lens is a tool that we've designed to help make remote monitoring as simple as possible for conservation organizations specifically. With that, we can find up-to-date, high-resolution imagery from a number of different sources for the specific areas that you're working to protect. And we also can tack on to that different tools to help interpret what you're seeing on a lot of that data. So things around, for instance, analysis, reporting, and so forth. The other thing that I think is really important with remote monitoring for any conservation organization is to make sure that it's something that your whole team can understand and share visibility and insights across anyone that's participating in your stewardship work. So put simply, just to kind of set our intention here, our goal at Upstream is to make remote sensing accessible and efficient with an easy to use tool that's focused specifically again on conservation and resource management. So as we go along, these are some of the organizations that have informed how we do this work. We have over 250 organizations, many of them land trusts, lots of other folks across the conservation community who collectively are monitoring over 56 million hectares in Lens currently. And a little smattering of some of the organizations, in addition to our partners from the Nature Trust of New Brunswick, who joined us today, who I'm sure would be happy to talk with folks who are interested in some perspective on how they do this too. But before we jump into all the cool tools and how they work, I also just want to make sure that we're starting from a place where really, with any technology tool, we want to understand what problems we're trying to solve. And in this case, there are many different questions that we can be answering using remote monitoring. So for instance, you can think about how larger scale changes across a landscape might be affecting, say, an entire watershed. You could be thinking about the efficiency of working with limited capacity, limited funding to do effective, efficient monitoring. We can also think about some of the ways that remote monitoring tools can help to understand and prevent issues where maybe new activities on the easement may be detected before they constitute some kind of enforcement issue. There's also the question of trying to just get a handle on what don't we know, what unexpected disturbances might be coming up on properties that we're not aware of that we need to check up on. So once we've got an idea of what we're looking for, then we can start to choose the right tools for that job. When it comes to remote data, there's a whole slew of different options out there. So the way we think about this is to basically bring as much as possible under one roof so that on a case-by-case basis, depending on your monitoring objectives and questions, you can pick and choose the right tools for the job. So some of the things to consider might be the resolution of imagery. So for instance, a resolution of say 30 centimeters might be able to identify, like you see here, some of these small features like solar panels and fence lines and small structures. Whereas the 10-meter data that we see on the right-hand side might be better for looking at larger landscape change because that comes in very frequently. That one comes in every 5 days, actually. So frequency, resolution, seasonality for some of the issues that you might be looking at. These are all factors that we're going to take into account when we're sort of exploring some of these different tools. And later on, we can show you a little bit more what they look like in practice and how you get your hands on them. But all to say, we try to partner with as many different data sources as we can. You'll see at the top, Maxar, Airbus, Planet, Nearmap, as well as a number of public data sources are the ones that we work with primarily. So in a moment, we'll hear from our friends of Nature Trust New Brunswick, again, with just some really helpful firsthand accounts of how they've done this work and how they got started with it. But a couple of reminders I always like to throw in before we get into the weeds. First off, as Morgan mentioned, there are perhaps, especially if you're a land trust, different standards and practices and regulations you may want to keep in mind as you're pursuing any sort of monitoring program. So always just be aware of what those are, and you can ask around any of us or other folks in the community. I'm sure we'd be happy to share more about those. Which brings me into number 2, just learn from other organizations that have experience doing this. Like I mentioned before, we work with over 250 orgs that use this in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of knowledge in the community. Remote monitoring, I think, also is something that can help us prioritize that really valuable in-person time that we get meeting with landowners, being on the land, so that we can use that for the highest impact work that we do. And finally, I just wanted to mention, with all of these different approaches and different tools, it's important to think about your own internal practices and make sure you set things up that are replicable, easy to follow. As with any good investigation, make sure you can explain your methods and how someone else can do the same thing. So with that, I'll hand it over to Courtney now to talk a little bit about how Nature Trust got started and how they're using remote monitoring in their work.
Thanks, Jake. So hi there, I'm Courtney LaRue. I'm Stewardship Manager with the Nature Trust of New Brunswick, which is a provincial land trust that was founded in 1987. Over the past decade alone, we've experienced rapid growth, expanding from just 37 to 97 preserves that are currently under our direct care. In addition to those 97, we also hold 15 properties in trust for a partner organization, bringing our total portfolio to just under 7,000 hectares, nearly 1,000 of which are managed in trust. Our preserves span quite a remarkable geographic range. You can go back to the previous slide there, Jake. We have quite the range from all across our province. Some of them are located over 300 kilometers from our office one way. Others are remote islands. Sometimes we have islands off of islands, making accessibility and site conditions really variable. Each of our properties presents a unique set of stewardship requirements and risk profiles, from sites that are visited regularly that have active community engagement to sites with limited access and higher environmental sensitivity. As our portfolio has expanded, so has the complexity of our stewardship responsibilities, which has led us to explore innovative tools and approaches to manage this growing network effectively. Can go to the next, yeah. So as part of our stewardship strategy, we've adopted a structured, risk-based monitoring model that's designed to scale with our expanding portfolio and improve how we allocate our resources. Our approach includes a 3-year rotational monitoring schedule where high-risk or high-use sites, so those that have public access, urban preserves, or sites with a history of encroachments, are monitored annually through our in-person visits, and then lower risk sites, so those that would be remote or difficult to access, don't have any infrastructure, are visited every 3 years with remote monitoring in the off years. We selected Lens after trialing a few other tools that required a bit of a higher technical capacity and didn't quite meet our needs, but Lens allows us to review this high-resolution satellite imagery for our preserves. We can flag potential changes and direct our site visits to areas that require that in-person follow-up. This hybrid approach helps us to adhere to the Canadian Land Trust standards and practices. We're among the first to be certified through the Conservation Excellence Certification Program, and this is a top priority for us. It also helps us to increase our thoroughness by identifying changes like clearing, erosion, any kind of active encroachment that may go unnoticed in a single in-person visit. We are able to improve our staff's safety by reducing the need to access hazardous or remote terrains, and also enables us to have data-driven decision-making, which supports better prioritization of restoration projects, engagement opportunities, and risk mitigation efforts. Remote monitoring basically helps us to meet our duty of care by ensuring every property is reviewed at least once a year. It also frees up our time and resources, allowing our staff to focus more deeply on preserves that require more active management. Overall, Lens enhances our ability to care for our network of preserves that is just ever growing, and with the attention and level of detail and accountability that they deserve. So now I'll pass it over to my coordinator, Shraddha, who will walk you through a few examples of what we're using remote sensing for.
Hello everyone, so I'm Shraddha, Stewardship Coordinator working with Nature Trust of New Brunswick, and today I'm going to talk about few of our example of properties where we used remote sensing from the lands. One of our properties, so many of our properties has a restricted access. One of that is South Wolf Island, which is a very remote and sensitive preserve, and it is also key breeding habitat for the birds, so that we have the limit strict access during the breeding seasons, and it is unsafe to access during off seasons because of the tidal conditions and coastal weather. So we use remote monitoring to check on our equipment. We have deployed one of our shiny equipment called automatic recording unit to track species diversity and overall habitat health of the preserve. And we use remote sensing to monitor, keep an eye on our equipment, monitor for the cleanup needs, assess habitat health, and check on our public access. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we used carbon monitoring of our nature preserves. So you can see the on the left side we can see the location of our automatic recording unit which we have deployed, and we can keep an eye on our equipment to see if its equipment is still there or if anything happens to that. And on the right side you can see the carbon monitoring of South Wolf Island, where we using the lens we figure it out that we have the average canopy cover 34%, average canopy height is 5.6 meters, which is lower, but as compared to this is the coastal forest, it has the coastal harsh conditions of high wind and storms. That's why it might be the reason of having the lower canopy height and low canopy cover, but it's ideal for the coastal forest like this remote island. And this preserve stores above ground carbon of 1000 metric ton, which is like a 26 metric ton per hectare, which is the ideal amount for the coastal forest like this. From doing remote sensing monitoring, we can have a long-term monitoring of our carbon storage that can contribute to carbon sequence and the climate conditions. So we can use long-term remote sensing data to monitor the habitat health of this preserve. Next slide. Another main concern was the liability and risk. So one of our island is off the another island and it's heavy human use, which is difficult to monitor frequently. And it has like many camps and cabins, which requires check on adherence to license agreements, any human encroachment or any issue of liability risk. We also use the remote monitoring through lands to identify some cleanup hotspots. So during our in-person visit, we visit to those hotspots to see and do the cleanup. And we also use for land cover data to check any land cover changes over period of time. For example, you can see in the graph from data from the land cover impact observatory from 2017 to 2013, and you can see there is no significant change occur to this island, which means that there might not major disturbance to the island over period of time. And we can keep monitoring land cover change data over period of time. Next slide. So here you can see our land cover monitoring of the camp. This is one of our camp on the left side of the image, and you can see in the graph there is a major vegetation loss happened in 2021, which means this camp might have established on 2021, or there was major tree cutting happened around this area of the camp. So you can figure it out when the camp was developed or any construction was developing in your preserves, and any major tree cutting or potential issues, or you can identify and you can visit during the in-person visit. Next slide, please. Also, we can use lands to identify any major waste deposition, marine debris, or any structure that has developed. For example, in this image, you can see there is some deposition, either it's some waste deposition or some structure developed. And during in-person visit, we go to those spots and check on those areas. So we don't have like a potential issues over there. Next slide, please. Another major concern was the staff safety. So few of our sites are highly remote and difficult to access those locations, which poses risk to the staff. So we use remote monitoring for compliance and detect any potential issues or violations, and used to check on due diligence and accountability. For example, this is one of our preserves. We use land cover data from ESA World Cover through lands, and you can see there is a major, not a major change, but there is a change in the grassland in 2020 to 2021. This can be indicate that is the late spring season in 2020, then the 2021, or some climate variables or changes. But for 1 year data, it won't be that effective. But if we monitor year or over year for a long period of time, that can give us data about the climate change, and we can plan our future planning accordingly. Some of our properties are huge. For example, one of our conservation easement is 926 hectares, and it requires 22 person hours to monitor plus 4 hours travels to do in-person monitoring, which cost around $2,500, while remote monitoring cost around $100. So we schedule 3 years remote monitoring plan for one, in which one in-person visits to cover this kind of sites, which are huge among us and requires a lot of staff hours and resources. So you can see on the right side, it's our property, which has some building envelope. And you can see in 2012, there was no construction happened, but while you can see in 2020, some development appeared. However, this was under the building envelope, so it wasn't big concern for us, but you can highlight those kind of hotspots and you can visit during the in-person visit to highlight the potential issues or any human disturbance to our prisons. So now I'll pass to the Jack.
All right, thanks, Shraddha. It's really cool to hear a little bit more about some of the specific motivations that you guys have for using remote monitoring and where those come into play. So thanks for sharing that. I'm going to jump out of our slides here for a moment, and let's take a look at a few examples in Lens so we can play around with some things. I grabbed a couple different sites here that we can take a quick look at for a bit, and then we'll follow this up with some Q&A. So if there's anything you want to come back to, just keep that in the back of your mind. So try to grab a few examples that might represent some of the diversity of types of issues and landscapes that folks on the call might be dealing with. But starting out, here was what I thought was a really cool example of a restoration project that I had heard about. So this is the Bones Creek Habitat Management Area. So just to give you a little bit of context of where we're looking right now, our property boundaries are here in white, and we are here just kind of right along the border in Southern Ontario. So as I zoom in, you can see that right now I'm looking at an image from 2005. So earlier I mentioned we have imagery available in Lens specifically that comes from a bunch of different sources. So I can click into this dropdown to see what we have to work with off the bat. Now, because there was some restoration work done here, I was really curious to understand some of the longer term history, right? So going back to 2005, we had publicly available data here that was at 1 meter resolution. And this comes in about every couple of years. So it provides a really nice sort of ongoing way to monitor that change. So here you also see that I've got some notes. So I mentioned that one of the things I find really important with remote monitoring is to keep this collaborative. So Allison is the person on my team who was able to come in here and take a pass to see, what she could find. So if I click into Allison's note here, I can pull up that same image she was looking at and see some of the history here about some of the partnerships with the county and the Conservation Authority here who were doing some of the work on the ground to reintroduce native species in this case and restore some of the wetlands. So moving along, I can get a little more specific about some of the things that Allison noticed. Like here, she made a note of some tree growth that she was seeing between 2005 and 2010. So again, using that publicly available data that's all ready to go here in Lens as soon as we added our site, we can see where, how that has actually progressed and check up on what she observed. The wetland restoration here, I think, is one of the coolest parts. So let's take a look at this note. So down in the southern part of this property, here was our before in 2010. And in 2012, we can see that we're starting to get somewhere. So again, using just public data here, but let's tap in here to see what else we have to work with. So I can filter this by resolution, for instance. So these are some smaller details, right? So again, thinking of the questions we're trying to answer, I want to know how and when some restoration work proceeded. I can get some higher resolution imagery specifically and look at something like this. So Nearmap is one of the commercial data vendors that we work with. And in April of 2023, they captured this image that we decided to pull up in Lens. So again, we can see that's kind of progressing. We can definitely see where some of that tree planting took place. I can zoom in a ways and pull up a little bit more detail, see some of those rows of trees. And I thought that was just a really neat way to confirm what was actually going on with that restoration work. Now we can go through and make more and more notes. You'll see some other details just to give you a sense of scale. Some power lines run through the property over here. So Allison noted on that same image. If we zoom in, we can see, where those are running. So some of those very fine details with that high resolution imagery can be pretty easy to spot. And we even have some 15 centimeter imagery from that same source right over here. So she noticed this area that looks like it encroaches a little bit onto some of that area, butts up right against that wood lot. And so we can keep tabs on anything that might be going on in those neighboring parcels as well. once we're happy with some of the observations that we've made, it's also really easy to share this information, especially through some of these reports that we have. So if I just click into our reporting button, I can take those notes that Allison made and have that in a really easy to digest sort of format. So I would think not just about the cool shiny tools, right? Of like, oh, there's some really high resolution imagery that we can access. That's great. But once you have your hands on it, making that intelligible across your team, I think is really fantastic. Being able to just quickly go in and understand what's happening on the landscape that you care about, and be able to share that with partners who may be able to help support your protection efforts. I think are really worthwhile. I'll pop back over here for a moment just to mention that, again, there's a lot of data sources, and if folks want to get into that in the Q&A, I'm happy to. But just to briefly mention, with some of those commercial imagery sources, it can be kind of tough to get our hands on that, right? I'm not sure, maybe some of you have tried that before. The way this works in Lens is that we can just come over here to see what all of those different vendors we work with have captured in the course of their operations. We also can be more specific if we want to request custom imagery. But something like this, I could scroll down and see all of the images that have been captured recently from Airbus. If I want to filter maybe to just some of the ones that are going to have the least cloud cover and some of the highest resolution, maybe one of these data sources will do the trick for what I'm looking at. So let's say last year, maybe I had my pick of these different options, and let's say I wanted to know what was going on in July. I can take a quick preview of that image, and for this area, my units here are in acres, so 403 acres, and I come out to just under $25 to get that image and start working with it. Yeah, so once you have your data in Lens, you're starting to make some observations. There's a lot of fun things you can do with this. So let's go to a different example for a moment. This is the Temagami Forest up north of Sudbury. So pretty large area here, and this area of interest that we've added encompasses crownland, some working forest. We've got provincial parks as well, so a kind of interesting network of different levels of protection here. So Katie was one who came in and made some observations here first. And one kind of fun thing that after Katie added this, I realized is we're actually looking at the highest point in Ontario here, which we can zoom in and we can set a point on the map at a certain location. And this is, I believe, 4-meter resolution imagery. So not all that high res. We can actually see that fire tower that I've added into my note for a little context. What I really want to show you on this one, though, is a couple of things. So first, let's say we have some information already that we want to pull into this to sort of layer some context on the images that we're seeing. In this case, we've got the boundaries of some of the provincial parks in the area that Ontario Parks manages. So I can very easily just tack those on to see, where would we need to be maybe more concerned about potential encroachments or something like that. And there was an area that I noticed got pretty close. So down in this section over here, you'll notice there's definitely been some logging activity here, and it actually tracks quite closely with this boundary. Something that we can take advantage of is some of the higher frequency data that comes from sources like, say, Sentinel-2, if you're familiar with that. If I scroll down a little ways, let's see this note, for instance, I can click into and pull up vegetation data. There's two especially cool things I think about satellite data. One is that you can go back in time, which obviously we can't do, in the physical world. The other is that we can see things the human eye just can't see. So in this case, we're looking at an index that tells us about photosynthetic activity in this location. So we can really make that pop where the vegetation has declined or where it's doing well. And this data comes in so frequently that I could very easily come back and run an analysis to see, in this location I'm interested in right here, how has vegetation changed in, say, the last year or 2 years, or going back even to 2015 is when Sentinel launched. So let's just do the last 2 years as an example. I can run that analysis and it'll start grabbing data from, again, every 5 days, conditions were good, and we can see some like seasonal variation, which we'd expect. But what about when something is unexpected? Here's one that I noticed where I believe it's this note, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a road that was developed, right? So looking at just the true color imagery, we can see that it's not super clear, but I could do, let's say, leave something like this as well. Look at vegetation, and maybe I want to know when that particular change occurred. I could do the same analysis, and I could then see when it was high, when it was low, with a lot more frequency. So pause there for a moment, come back, and let's just see if there's anything else on this one that I wanted to mention. Oh, here it was. Okay. This one confused me at first because I was, I had working forest on my mind. I was looking for some of these areas cleared because of timber operations. And this just didn't quite fit the same pattern. So my mind then went to maybe there was a fire here. So with that vegetation data, I can then supplement it with all kinds of other things. You'll see here, if I look in this drop down, you could use information like burn index that more specifically looks at features on the landscape that might indicate there's been a fire here, or there's fire recovery that's ongoing. Shraddha, I know, mentioned a couple of different land cover data sets. So there's a lot we can look at here to sort of get some more information. But let's look at the burn index, because that's, yep, sure enough, burn index is showing really high in some of these different patches. And let's even take a look at a similar image from that point. Let's see if I can brighten this up a little bit for you. Yeah, sure enough, you can see some of these really dark brown areas. This is where the true color imagery, we can see it, we can kind of confirm our suspicion that the burn index really makes it pop. It makes it easier to observe and understand. So let's say I wanted to select a certain area and measure, like, how much of this area burned. I could, let's say, select burn index and say, like, anything that had a high, high value on this threshold. What was going on in the last 2 years? When did we notice that? So here we go. See this sudden bump where 8% of that area, or 281 acres, just about, registered as burned in August of 2024. The sensing right before that, beginning of the month, the fire. So now we know, okay, August, that's when this happened. All right, so let's go for something completely different. I had the opportunity to meet with a bunch of folks from Ontario's conservation authorities recently, and I heard that mining was an issue a lot of folks deal with. So I have a kind of scale this is going to be a little outrageous, but any folks that are working out in Alberta who are on the call may recognize, the Pearl oil sands mine in near Fort McKay that had a couple of well-publicized leaks from this tailings pond right up here in recent years. So for instance, we can see that there was a breach that was discovered in May of 2022 from this note that I made 2 years ago now. So this is still something that I can go back and see, but wasn't disclosed to the public for a long time. So according to CPAWS up there, there's some really important habitats just beyond the industrial development here. And so it's easy for us to see features like that, or to see using a surface water index when the tailings pond may have been dewatered or something like that. So definitely some interesting examples from the mining world. Real quick, I'll show you one other thing as well, which I just want to end on a much more fun note. And if anyone here has ever been to Churchill, Manitoba, but polar bear capital of the world, I thought there might be some interesting things to see with wildlife. And I thought it was really cool too, to note some of the changes in sea ice as well. So for folks working in the north, lots of interesting things to dig into there. But just very quickly, take a look at some of the high-res imagery. You can see some beluga whales. So it's a really important gathering area for belugas seasonally. So with 30 centimeter resolution imagery here, it was really neat that very, very easy to spot. So there's some cool wildlife applications beyond some of the more like land use kind of stuff. So I'll pause there so we have a little bit of time for questions as well. Again, drop some of those in the Q&A as you have them. But Morgan, I'll hand it over to you to take a gander through those and share what folks are thinking about.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jake. That was really great presentations from both of you, and we do have some questions. So I guess the first one will be for you, Jake. Is it possible to use lens data in GIS? Can you speak more to how Lens can integrate into a workflow / organization that has historically used GIS?
Yeah, definitely. So Obviously, I think geospatial data is something that folks interact with in a lot of different ways, and traditionally a lot of organizations use tools like QGIS or Esri resources for that. So Lens does play nice with some of those other tools. You can take there are a few different ways that you can stream data from Lens into other tools like that. And depending on the data source as well, sometimes we can do data downloads, which is really cool. I think the thing that's really helpful here as well is that it kind of broadens access to geospatial data in a way that the learning curve is a lot lower. So I think a lot of folks get intimidated by the idea of working in GIS if they don't have the training for it. But understanding some of the insights geospatial data has to offer are really important for everyone in this work, I think. So that's part of the hope, is that if you want to take information and feed that into existing systems you have, you can do that. And if you want other folks to be able to tap into it without having to go that route, do that as well.
Great. And while we are talking about integration, is it possible to integrate data from Lens into a CRM or other client relationship data within an organization?
Well, that's a good one. Courtney, remind me, do you guys use one of those integrations with some of their database tools? I forget off the top of my head if you guys do that.
We do. We have a different software integrated with our Salesforce, but we don't personally have Lens integrated with Salesforce.
Yeah, there's a couple tools. So Landscape and Locate, for instance, are two that I know have become quite popular in the land trust community in particular. So there are direct integrations for folks using those, and some other ways you can integrate with different tools. But yeah, if anyone's got specifics they're curious about, happy to field those questions too.
Okay, and this question came in for the Nature Trust of New Brunswick, and it was answered, but I'll just read it out loud because I think maybe some other people on the call might be interested. So the question was, do the remote to in-person monitoring cost comparisons only include staff hours, or does it include other costs like travel, with the comparison to Lens costs? And the answer was the cost for in-person monitoring includes staff hours and travel-related expenses, including fieldwork time, fuel, vehicle use, and the time spent traveling to and from the sites. But then I will also say there was a follow-up for that one,
And Morgan,
which is,
yes, pulling that question up, one other note on that. There's a really helpful resource that has some information about the experiences of a group of land trusts that were all part of a grant program a couple of years ago that investigated that question. So we'll drop in the link. The Land Trust Alliance's remote monitoring toolkit would be one to look into some more for ask that question. Maybe.
Yeah, no, that's a great resource for sure. And yeah, so to add to that question, what did the costs include for using Lens software or data systems? So what was the cost comparison, if you can share that, Courtney or Shraddha?
Yeah, so like Shraddha had answered that question previously, that we included travel time, staff time, mileage into the in-person monitoring costs, and then the Lens monitoring costs are the actual price for the imagery and then the staff time to analyze that data.
Okay. So what were the most useful resources for your team as you were getting started with remote monitoring? That would also be for Nature Trust of New Brunswick.
Sure. For us, the most useful kind of tool was Jake, Lens itself. The support offered, the answering questions for us, brainstorming with us when we have maybe unique or new questions that we're looking at using Lens to find answers for. Upstream has always been great at providing quick answers for us and kind of helping us along the way.
Glad to hear that, Courtney. Thank you.
All right. Next question. What are the names of and costs of the data sources available for satellite or aerial surveys?
Oh, sure. Let me, I'm gonna bring the visual back up for a moment here. So let's do this. Okay. So I put imagery into two major buckets, public and commercial data. Public data typically is going to be free, but the trade-offs of that usually are going to be around something like frequency or resolution. So for instance, Sentinel-2, fantastic on frequency, comes in every 5 days. Resolution might not be appropriate for some of the easement monitoring concerns that a lot of folks have specifically. So again, depends on the questions you have. Commercial data, we typically get more in terms of quantity, and we also get higher resolution, but sometimes there's a trade-off where we don't have a way to predict where a lot of these commercial vendors are. They're capturing imagery based on the demand. So that's why we kind of diversify as much as possible. We work specifically with Maxar, Airbus, Planet, and Nearmap on commercial data. Each of those have a few different tools. You'll see here there's like a Maxar 30 centimeter and a Maxar 50 centimeter, a few different data sources from Planet and Airbus as well. Yeah, if anyone wants to reach out with more, I'm happy to geek out on data specs anytime, but hopefully that answers your question for now.
Okay, thanks. So I guess, yeah, this could be either Jake or Trust of New Brunswick if you've done this. Do you use lens to quantify completion of restoration activity? So looking at like numbers of trees planted per hectare or wetlands constructed, or like, can you quantify things like that through lens?
Yeah, Courtney and Shraddha, if you have specific examples of that, would love to hear. But just generally, I will say that, yeah, there are a lot of different analysis tools that we didn't have a chance to look at just now that can do things like measuring areas. We can also get automated alerts for unexpected changes. So there's a lot of different resources that might go into that, depending on, what types of restoration outcomes you're looking to quantify. But yeah, in general, a lot of those sorts of things are going to be built in there as well.
Okay, so another question came up saying, Jake, compliments to you that you're great at seeing things in these images. So does it take training and expertise to do this, or is it more obvious after you've done it a couple of times? Or, how easy would it be for somebody that hasn't used this or done this before to do it and find these little changes that you pointed out today?
I think there's a couple different factors, I think, that determine how easy something is to spot. So like in the belugas example, right, you've got a kind of contrast to play with of background versus object, and that can be really helpful. If you're working in, let's say, a more open environment, say grassland or more open landscape up north, you might have an easier time monitoring for certain things like structures that could be obscured by canopy cover. So depending on where you are, there's a little bit of, I would say, there's a little bit of adjustment you get over time to get better at it. But from my personal experience, first time I worked with this was actually as a volunteer for a land trust, doing some reviews of their easements. And I was like up and running in about 5 minutes. It was like way easier than I expected. And that was one of the things that made me interested in some of the remote monitoring work that folks were starting to do. This was around 5-6 years ago, maybe. Shraddha, I know you do a lot of like the actual like review of imagery for the Nature Trust. I'm curious if you have any like tips or kind of quick reflections on how it's gone for you as you've gotten started with it.
You mean with the carbon storage stuff? Yeah, so like for the carbon storage is like a recently new introduced feature in Lens, and it just goes older as 2020. So we don't have very old data of carbon storage, but we really like to use as we go process further how our like maybe from now to next 20 years how our preserves have changed or any huge climate change impact happen to our preserve or any disturbance is happening to our preserve, and we can know like how much our preserve stores the carbon. I just tried with one of our preserve, but I want to try all our preserve to know that how much carbon storage and how much nature trust contribute to carbon sequestration.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, here's another one. What if an incident happens in between the annual monitoring that you would usually be doing through Lens or on the phone? So does Lens have an AI alert capacity to notify of emergencies like this, or if changes are happening that you don't catch that one time you're looking at the property?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways to approach that. I think the automated alerting is for sure the easiest and a good way to get some peace of mind around some of those issues. So I think here I had an example on the mining site. So if we zoom back out, obviously over time, industrial sites, there's a lot of changes to see here, right? So this can be a good example where there's been expansion of some of the mining area, for instance, clearing of surrounding forest. So this lookout tool over here is looking out in the background for different kinds of things, again, we might not be thinking to look for. So here we can see where we turned on this vegetation change alert. And you can also customize these. So let's say you wanted to make a notification around land cover. When maybe tree cover changes to something else, I want to get notified. So again, you can tune this to whatever area you're working in. But in this case, we can see where we had an estimated vegetation drop in this area. Here's our before and then our after. So even though the vegetation data that this is based on isn't super high resolution, it gives us enough to say, hey, there's something to look at here. And so if I follow up with some of the imagery to get a better understanding, sure enough, we had forest, now we have bare ground. So that's the kind of thing that would be running in the background as you're going along. You're also welcome to order imagery more than once a year or use publicly available data that comes in between visits. So that's one of the nice things with remote monitoring, I think, is you can be flexible as new concerns come up. Maybe get a tip from a neighbor or a landowner that something's going on. Very easy to go in and review that quickly.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks. Okay, let's see. So a couple questions about the imagery that's available. So how far back in years do the data sets typically go?
That's also a good one. Yeah, so actually just pop into imagery comparison again. Depends on the source. I will say in general, a lot of the high resolution, what we call sub-meter data, start to become more prolific in this area, I would say in like 2018 to 2020. But there's variation. So Sentinel-2 was launched in 2015. So literally I'm talking about when the satellite was launched into orbit and started capturing imagery is how far back we're able to go. Some of these, like this USDA imagery, which is available in some areas close to the border, that was captured by plane. And so the starting point for that was when it was digitized, which was in around 2004, 2005. On the flip side, the Airbus Pleiades NEO program only launched maybe about 2 years ago or so, so much newer. But in general, I would say like imagery availability has got a lot better in this space in the last 5-ish years, I would say.
And then, so is there any IR or LiDAR information maps? And also, is there like elevation mapping available?
Okay, so we use some LiDAR derived data sources. So for folks that are familiar with LiDAR data, even though the visualization of that is very different from some of the raster and vector data that we're mostly going to be working with in Lens. So, there's the carbon data, for instance, that Shraddha was showing. That's trained on LiDAR data. We have that available from both Planet and Chloris, are two vendors we work with on that. So resolution varies from 3 to 30 meter with some of that data, which is LiDAR trained. Elevation data, like if we go back to, I guess really the only one with a little bit of elevation is this one, eh? If we pull up some imagery here, we can model any imagery on the 3D terrain. So especially in more mountainous areas where maybe there's like burn scars or something like that. We're in a relatively flat area still here, so this doesn't show up quite as dramatically as it might, let's say, out west or in some other areas. Used it in places affected by wildfire, for instance. You can see rather than just kind of the blotches of where fire scars are, if you put it on the terrain, you can really see like, oh, it was that hillside, for instance, that was affected or something like that. But yeah, so we can always throw that into the terrain model there.
Okay, great. I feel like we're drilling you with
Yeah,
all
happy
these
to.
technical questions, but yeah, it's good. Okay, so this is somebody who has experience with Lens. So an issue that they've run into is that sites can be so large that you need to piece together multiple imagery sources to get a complete view of the property, and this can make it awkward to do an analysis in Lens. Is there a way to get around this? So yeah, if you could speak to
A
that a
couple
little bit.
ways. Ultimately, what this comes down to is that for really large properties, you run into a challenge around imagery availability because of how large a satellite image is. Typically, satellite image is going to run about 26 square kilometers. And so if we've got a small area here, this one, I think I mentioned, was less than 500 acres. So if I wanted to go and order an image for this site, I think, what did we say? This was, what was like 20 bucks or something? Yeah, $24. If we want to order imagery for a really large area, that gets more challenging, but also I'll show you, there's a little bit of a kind of hacky way to visualize this, which I can pull up. Let's say, for instance, here we go. You can kind of see more of the tile here of the image. Our area is only this little bit in blue. And typically cloud cover is going to be something that we mask out. This is a data source that I'm pulling up that I would not use as a first pass, but we do make available if you want to dig further into some of these vendors' archives. The larger the area you get, the more likely you are to run up on the edge of the image. And so we want to break things down into manageable chunks. Another thing we can do is these partial orders. So you'll see here, like Allison ordered imagery for just this corner of the property to help make that more manageable. So in terms of managing cost, I think that's one consideration, is breaking down, like, do you need high-res imagery for the entire several thousand hectares, for instance, or can we get away with just focusing high-res data on our places that we're most concerned, or where lower res data indicated a potential follow-up issue? There are a couple different ways we can set up properties in Lens as well. So you'll see here, we've got this as like 2 separate parcels. So we can do what's called like a multi-location property. So depends a little bit on the geometry of your sites. If there's something, a little funny going on, we're happy to help set those up in a way that makes sense for you. But a few possible answers for you there.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I think we are winding down here. We have a few minutes left, so maybe we can get to one more question, which is just about, is all the true color imagery on Lens available to download and use in ArcGIS Pro with a subscription, or is it only imagery that is purchased?
Good question. This is one of the things that gets a tad complicated because we work with so many different vendors. Ultimately, the licensing terms that those vendors have will determine what you can do with their data. So we build that into Lens, so you don't really have to, really be thinking too much about like, am I using this the right way or not? Like, we kind of take care of that on the back end. But it does mean that, for instance, if you want to do GeoTIFF downloads of data, Airbus, which happens to be the most prolific vendor I would say that we work with in terms of number of images that come into Lens, they allow GeoTIFF downloads for all of their stuff. If we do custom orders through what's called tasking, so again, that's where we would maybe say like, hey, Airbus or Planet, we want imagery for this particular place, this particular time, and we can do that as well. It's just a trade-off of cost versus control. Tasking gives you, full rights to download any of those images, use them however you'd like. Across the board, the thing that we can use to pull imagery from Lens into GIS is, since we're streaming data from these vendors into Lens, we can stream it from Lens into those other tools. So to get a little technical for a moment on that, we come into the details for one of the images that we're looking at. We can see what download options are available. So Nearmap, for instance, allows PNG downloads, but not GeoTIFF. So you won't have to worry about like downloading something you're not supposed to. It's already built in. And then we can stream data using one of these streaming links, either web app tile server or XYZ links. So you can just grab that, and then all of the images you're working with in Lens will be available in your GIS tool. So those are kind of your two routes.
Okay, amazing. So I guess we'll wrap up there. There is the last question. They're very interested in learning more about the software and applications in conservation. So yeah, asking if we'll be sharing our emails to keep in touch, and the answer is yes. Our contact information is dropped in the chat there. So if anybody has any follow-up questions for any of the speakers here today, feel free to get in touch. with any of your questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Morgan. Yeah, appreciate everybody joining today. Yeah, any of us be happy to field more questions if you want to reach out.
So I guess we will wrap things up here. So thank you. Yeah, thanks, Strada and Courtney and Jake, for your presentations. This was really informative, and based on all the questions that we got, I think there's a lot of interest in lens and remote monitoring and applications and conservation and, you know, property monitoring and stewardship. So yeah, we really appreciate you presenting today. And for everybody that is in attendance, as Jake said, we feel free to reach out to any of the speakers with further questions. If we didn't get to your question, we could follow up with you via email later. So yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks to the presenters. Jake, I don't know if you want to say a few words to her.
No, I think that covers it. Again, happy to chat more. The recording will be sent out to everybody. So you're welcome to share with folks who weren't able to make it as well. But yeah, hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And thanks again for joining.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.